Tom sat at the small wooden table in his kitchen, staring at the worn photograph of his daughter, Anna. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock on the wall. Life had not been easy for him since leaving the service. He was a veteran who had seen more than most men could carry in one lifetime. After the war, his wife had walked away, unable to handle the silence in his eyes. That left Tom alone with Anna, a little girl who still looked at him with trust, as if her father could fix the whole world. Every morning, Tom packed Anna's school lunch before heading to whatever odd job he could find. Sometimes it was fixing fences for neighbors, other times it was carrying boxes at the local store. The money was never much, but he made sure Anna never felt the hunger or the weight of his struggles. At night, he told her bedtime stories, hiding his own pain behind soft words and a gentle smile. When he heard about the new veteran boot camp program, he hesitated. The program was built for training veterans into new positions of leadership and discipline. Tom wasn't sure if his body could take it anymore. His knees ached, his back stiffened in the mornings, and sleep was never easy. But the thought of Anna's future pushed him forward. If he could prove himself again, maybe he could earn more stable work, maybe even benefits that would help raise her better. He signed his name on the form with a hand that shook slightly, not from fear, but from hope. The first day at boot camp was harder than he expected. The yard was filled with younger men, strong and confident, their eyes sharp with eagerness. Most were in their 20s, fresh, quick, and loud. Tom walked in with his old boots, his posture still firm but slower than the rest. When the drill began, he struggled to keep up with the warm-up runs. His steps were heavy, his breath harsh in his chest. It did not take long for the whispers and laughter to start. "Look at the old guy trying to keep up. His knees sound like firecrackers. Bet he won't last a week." Tom heard every word, but he did not answer. He kept running, one foot in front of the other, each step carrying the memory of harder days. Compared to what he had faced before, their laughter was only noise. He had walked through fire before. Still, deep inside, a sting cut through him, not for himself, but for the thought of Anna ever hearing such things about her father. At night in the barracks, he sat quietly on his bunk, cleaning his boots while the others laughed and told stories. He pulled out Anna's picture from his pocket and whispered softly, "I'll make you proud, baby girl." That photo was his anchor, his reminder of why he was here. On the second week, things began to shift. The camp received a new commander, Laura. She was a woman known across bases for her strength and discipline. She had sharp eyes, the kind that saw everything and missed nothing. The recruits stiffened as soon as she walked across the field. Her presence carried weight, and even the loudest voices grew quiet. Tom stood in line with the others, sweat dripping from his face after drills. Laura's gaze swept across the rows, examining every man. When her eyes landed on Tom, something flickered in her face. For the smallest moment, her expression changed, almost as if she had recognized something. Tom did not notice. He was too focused on catching his breath, pulling at the collar of his shirt where the fabric clung to his back. Underneath, hidden by the damp cloth, was the tattoo he carried. A tattoo not of design or decoration, but of memory, of history, of names. It stretched across his back, etched into him forever, marking him as part of something few had lived through. Laura's gaze lingered. She tilted her head slightly, her lips parting as though a thought caught in her chest. Then she straightened again, her voice firm as she called out the next drill. No one else noticed that brief pause, that strange stillness in her eyes. The training grew harsher. The recruits pushed their bodies under the burning sun, through mud, across walls and ropes. Tom's arms trembled, his legs ached, but he kept moving. Every laugh behind his back was answered with silence and endurance. He never lashed out, never complained. The others began to look at him strangely, not out of respect yet, but out of confusion. How could a man so slow, so worn, keep refusing to quit? One evening, as the recruits rested after a long day, one of them muttered, "Why is he even here? He should be home, rocking chairs and telling war stories." They laughed again, but the laughter was weaker now, less sure. Because while Tom's body looked tired, his spirit did not. Tom lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. He thought of Anna again, of her smile waiting for him at home, of her voice when she asked, "Daddy, are you strong?" He whispered into the night, "Yes, Anna. I'm strong for you." Laura, walking past the barracks, stopped when she heard that voice. She didn't step inside, didn't speak. But the sound of his quiet promise reached her ears. She remembered the brief glimpse of ink she had seen beneath his shirt that morning, and the weight of recognition pressed harder on her chest. She whispered to herself, "Who are you really, Tom?" And though the camp settled into silence, the question lingered in the night air, unanswered. The sun rose on the training field, painting the sky in orange and gold. The recruits lined up as usual, rubbing sore muscles and yawning after another restless night. Tom stood among them, shoulders square, though his body ached in silence. His eyes were tired, but his spirit held steady. He had learned long ago that pain was part of the journey. That morning, Commander Laura decided to push them harder. She barked orders, her voice sharp and commanding. "Today, no excuses. You will run, climb, crawl, and push yourselves until I say stop. This is not about strength in your body, it is about strength in your mind." The recruits groaned quietly, already knowing it would be a long day. When the run began, the young men leapt forward quickly, their speed showing off their youth and energy. Tom moved slower, his steps heavy but steady. Again, the whispers started. "He's too slow. He won't finish. Old bones can't keep up." But Tom didn't let the voices enter his heart. He breathed in, breathed out, counting each step. In his mind, he saw Anna waiting for him at home, her small hands clapping when he told her he was training. "Don't stop, Daddy," her voice echoed in his memory. That memory became his fuel. The run stretched across uneven ground, through dust and heat. By the time they reached the last lap, some of the younger recruits had already slowed down, clutching their sides, their energy fading. Tom was still running. His pace never changed, slow but steady, step by step, mile by mile. When he crossed the finish line, sweat pouring down his face, he didn't smile, didn't look for applause. He simply stood tall, catching his breath, his silence louder than words. Laura watched from the side. She didn't cheer, but her eyes narrowed with interest. There was something about the way Tom moved, not fast, not flashy, but with unshakable will. She had seen soldiers like that before, in the stories of missions that most people never heard about. Her mind returned again to the tattoo she had glimpsed on his back. Later that day came the obstacle course. Ropes hung from wooden beams, tall walls stretched across the field, and mud pits waited at the bottom of every climb. The recruits laughed and pushed each other, eager to show off their speed. When Tom stepped up to the first wall, some snickered again. "No way he makes it. He'll need a crane to pull him up." Tom placed his hands on the wood and looked up. His arms shook slightly, but he dug his fingers into the grooves and began to climb. Slowly, carefully, he pulled himself higher. His knees scraped, his boots slipped, but he refused to let go. Inch by inch, he reached the top, then rolled over, landing on the other side with a grunt. The laughter died down. At the rope climb, others rushed past him, swinging their bodies upward with ease. Tom took his time, gripping tightly, his face set in determination. Every pull brought sharp pain through his shoulders, but he didn't quit. By the time he reached the top, his arms burned, but he touched the beam with steady hands before sliding down. When the obstacle course ended, the recruits collapsed in the dirt, panting and groaning. Tom lowered himself to the ground, breathing heavily but calm. He looked worn out, yes, but not broken. That evening in the mess hall, the recruits spoke in lower voices. The jokes were fewer now, replaced by small glances at Tom. Some didn't want to admit it, but they were starting to see something different in him. Laura, however, saw more than determination. She had noticed the way he carried himself, not like someone proving himself for the first time, but like a man who had already faced battles far greater than this. And that tattoo, she couldn't get it out of her mind. When she dismissed the men for the night, she stayed behind in her office, staring at the notes she had written earlier. She drew the outline of the symbol she had seen beneath Tom's shirt. It was not a simple design. It was a mark of honor tied to a mission long buried in secrecy. She had read about it once in old files, missions where soldiers were sent knowing they might never return. Only a handful had survived, and their names were spoken with respect in quiet circles. She whispered to herself, could he be one of them? The next morning, Laura decided to test him. She ordered a new drill, climbing the high wall while blindfolded. The recruits groaned in disbelief. That's impossible, some muttered. Tom said nothing. He tied the blindfold, took a deep breath, and placed his hands on the wall. The others watched, half expecting him to fall. But slowly, carefully, Tom began to climb. He didn't move fast, but each step was sure, each grip strong. His mind pictured the wall as if he could see it, his memory guiding him. Halfway up, his arms trembled, his breath sharp, but he kept going. The recruits grew quiet, eyes fixed on the older man who refused to quit. Finally, Tom pulled himself over the top and stood on the wall for a brief moment before lowering himself down the other side. He untied the blindfold and looked around, breathing heavily. No one laughed this time. Silence filled the yard, heavy and strange. For the first time, the younger men saw him not as an old veteran, but as something else, someone stronger than they had thought possible. Laura stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. Where did you learn that kind of focus? Tom wiped sweat from his brow and answered quietly, when life leaves you no choice, you learn. She studied him, her heart unsettled. The tattoo, the endurance, the silence, it all pointed to something more. She didn't push further, but the question burned in her mind stronger than ever, who exactly was Tom? The morning air was heavy with fog as the recruits gathered in the training yard. Their uniforms were damp, boots sinking slightly into the wet ground. The camp had grown quieter in recent days. The laughter that once followed Tom around like a shadow was fading, replaced by glances that carried both curiosity and respect. Tom stood tall, even though his muscles ached from the blindfolded wall climb of the day before. He didn't show the pain on his face. Years of hardship had taught him to hide discomfort, to keep moving forward no matter what his body screamed. He looked around at the younger recruits. Their faces were fresh, their energy bright, but their spirits had started to bend. The drills had broken their arrogance, leaving them humbled. Commander Laura walked across the yard, her boots firm against the wet ground. The fog curled around her as if even the air respected her presence. She stopped in front of the line of men, her eyes scanning them, stopping for a moment on Tom. That same flicker crossed her face, quick but unmistakable. "Today," she announced, her voice steady, "you will face something harder than walls and ropes. You will face yourselves. A team is only as strong as its weakest link. We will test who stands, and who breaks." The recruits looked at each other nervously. They had learned by now that when Laura said test, it meant exhaustion, sweat, and pain. The challenge was simple in words but cruel in practice: carry heavy logs across the muddy field, together, without dropping them. Each team of 4 had to move in rhythm, lifting and walking as one. If one man stumbled, the whole team failed. When the groups formed, Tom ended up with 3 of the youngest recruits' boys who had been the loudest when mocking him. Their faces twisted with frustration. "Great. We're stuck with him," one muttered. Tom only adjusted his grip on the log and said quietly, "Then let's carry it." At first, the team struggled. The younger men tried to rush forward, moving too quickly, while Tom's pace was steady and slower. The log wobbled, their steps uneven, and soon they stumbled into the mud. The others cursed under their breath, blaming Tom. But he didn't argue. He only stood, wiped mud from his hands, and said, "Again. This time, together." Something in his tone was different. It wasn't weak. It wasn't defensive. It was calm, commanding, the kind of voice that expected to be heard. Against their pride, the young men listened. They lifted again, this time following Tom's slower rhythm. Step by step, they moved across the field. Their muscles screamed, their shoulders burned, but the log stayed steady. By the time they reached the finish, their breaths came in ragged gasps. They dropped the log together, collapsing in the mud. One of the young recruits looked at Tom with new eyes. How did you know what pace would work?" Tom wiped sweat from his brow and answered simply, "You can't win by rushing. You win by lasting." The lesson sank deep. The other recruits nearby had seen it too. The man they once laughed at had guided his team to success when they couldn't guide themselves. Laura watched from a distance, her arms crossed. She didn't smile, but her heart stirred. The mark on his back, the calm in his voice, the endurance in his steps, it was all connecting. She knew without doubt now that he was more than just a struggling single dad trying to prove himself. That night in the barracks, the air was different. Instead of laughter aimed at Tom, there was silence when he walked in, and a space cleared for him at the table. The men who once mocked him now leaned closer when he spoke, though he spoke little. Tom ate quietly, finishing his meal, then pulled out the small photo of Anna from his pocket. He didn't notice the recruits watching him as he looked at the picture with a softness in his eyes. He whispered, "Almost there, baby girl." The recruits exchanged glances. For the first time, they saw not just an old veteran, but a father carrying the weight of love and responsibility on his shoulders. Later, when the lights dimmed and the barracks quieted, Laura stood outside, listening again. She heard Tom's quiet breathing, steady and calm. She remembered her father once telling her, "The strongest soldiers are the ones who fight for someone else." The next morning, she tested the recruits again. This time, it was a fire drill: smoke bombs, alarms, Confusion in the dark. The recruits panicked, running in different directions. Voices shouted, footsteps stumbled, the yard filled with chaos. But in the middle of it all, Tom's voice rose above the noise. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, strong. This way. Stay low. Follow me. Men who had been frozen with fear suddenly moved, guided by his calm orders. He led them through the smoke, step by step, until they reached safety. When the drill ended, the recruits looked at him with wide eyes. None of them laughed anymore. Laura approached, her face unreadable. She stood in front of Tom, searching his eyes. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she asked quietly, "Why did you step up when you didn't have to?" Tom looked at her, his voice low but clear. "Because when others freeze, someone has to move. I've seen what happens when no one does." Her chest tightened at his words. She wanted to ask more, wanted to ask about the tattoo, about the missions she suspected he had survived. But she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she only nodded, her eyes softer than usual. As Tom walked away, Anna's picture still tucked in his pocket, Laura whispered under her breath, "You're not just any man. You're carrying something bigger." And for the first time, she felt a strange mix of respect and curiosity she could not ignore. The days at camp grew colder as autumn winds swept across the training yard. Leaves scattered over the muddy ground, crunching beneath boots as the recruits lined up each morning. The early laughter and arrogance had all but disappeared. Every man now carried tired eyes, blistered hands, and bruised shoulders. Yet, there was one thing that had changed even more: the way they looked at Tom. No longer was he just the old guy. The man they once mocked had become a quiet presence of strength. Some recruits even found themselves standing straighter when he walked by, as though his silence carried weight heavier than orders. But for Tom, the focus never shifted from his reason for being there, Anna. Every night, after the day's pain and drills, he pulled out her picture and whispered softly, "I'm almost there, baby girl. Just a little longer." Commander Laura had grown restless in those weeks. She had spent hours in her office reading through old files, searching for the mark she had glimpsed on Tom's back. She found what she feared and what she respected. That tattoo was tied to a mission that was nearly erased from memory. A mission where men were sent into a place no soldier should have survived. Many never returned. A handful did, and their names were hidden, their stories untold to the public. Laura leaned back in her chair one night, staring at the paper where she had sketched the tattoo's outline. Her chest tightened. He was there, she whispered to herself. He carried them all. The next morning, she tested the men again. This time it was endurance under weight-long marches across rough ground, carrying packs heavier than most recruits had ever felt. The men groaned as the straps dug into their shoulders, their steps faltering as the miles stretched on. Tom adjusted his pack, the straps cutting into his scarred skin, but he kept moving. Step by step, mile after mile, his boots hit the ground with steady rhythm. Some of the younger men collapsed, falling to their knees. Others begged for breaks. But Tom moved forward, not because he was faster, but because he refused to stop. At one point, a recruit stumbled beside him, dropping his pack. Without hesitation, Tom bent down, grabbed the second load, and carried it across his shoulders along with his own. His face twisted with pain, sweat pouring down his neck, but his steps did not falter. The others stared in disbelief. One whispered, "How is he doing that?" Laura watched closely. She saw the strain, the trembling in his arms, but she also saw the fire in his eyes. It wasn't pride driving him. It wasn't the desire to prove anyone wrong. It was something deeper, a promise. When the march ended, most of the recruits collapsed into the dirt, exhausted. Tom lowered the pack slowly, his body shaking, but he did not fall. He simply stood still, breathing hard, his gaze distant. That evening, the recruits gathered around him in the barracks. For the first time, one of the younger men spoke without sarcasm. "How do you keep going like that? Don't you ever think of quitting?" Tom looked at them, his voice calm and even. "I've seen what happens when you quit. I promised myself and my little girl that I won't ever do it again." The room fell silent. No one laughed. Some lowered their eyes, ashamed of the way they had mocked him before. Others nodded slowly, understanding a little of the weight he carried. Later that night, Laura called Tom into her office. He stood at attention, though his body ached from the march. She looked at him carefully, her voice quieter than usual. "I saw what you did today. Carrying 2 packs, keeping your men moving. That's not something just anyone can do." Tom didn't answer at first. He only said, "Someone had to." Laura studied him, her thoughts heavy. She wanted to tell him she knew. She wanted to ask about the tattoo, about the names carved into his skin, about the men who had been with him. But she didn't. Not yet. She knew if she asked, it might reopen wounds that never healed. Instead, she leaned forward and said, "You're teaching these recruits more than I ever could. Do you realize that?" Tom shook his head slightly. "I'm just trying to finish what I started." Her eyes softened. "You've already finished more than most men ever will." For a moment, silence filled the room. 2 soldiers, one carrying secrets, the other carrying questions, stood in quiet understanding. The next days brought even harsher training. Storms rolled over the camp, rain soaking the field, turning drills into a battlefield of mud. During one session, the recruits slipped and slid, some cursing loudly, others giving up in frustration. But Tom kept moving through the storm, pulling others to their feet when they fell, his hands muddy but firm. Laura watched from under her hood, the rain dripping down her face. She thought to herself, he doesn't lead with orders. He leads with action. By the time the storm passed, the recruits no longer mocked, no longer doubted. They began to look to Tom not as the weakest link, but as the man they wanted beside them when things grew impossible. That night, as the barracks grew quiet, Tom lay on his bunk, staring at Anna's picture again. For the first time, he allowed himself a small smile. Maybe, just maybe, she would be proud when she saw what he had done here. And outside, standing in the shadows near the doorway, Laura watched him quietly. Her heart carried a truth she hadn't spoken yet, but she knew it was time drawing closer. Soon, the others would see what she already knew: Tom was not just another veteran in training. He was the man who carried the past on his back and still stood strong. The base had grown strangely quiet after the story of John's tattoo spread. Whispers followed him wherever he walked, not of mockery anymore, but of respect, confusion, and even awe. Yet, for John, the silence was heavier than the laughter that once echoed. He was not seeking attention. He had only come for a chance to rebuild his life, to give his son a better future. But the world around him was changing. One evening, after a long day of training, John sat alone outside the barracks, staring at the fading sunset. His hands were rough from drills, his shoulders sore, but his thoughts wandered only to Daniel. He pulled a small picture from his pocket, the same one he always carried. His little boy's smile stared back at him, a reminder of why he endured everything. As he looked at the photo, footsteps approached. It was Commander Grace. She stood silently for a moment, then slowly sat beside him. "You remind me of someone I used to know," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. John glanced at her but stayed quiet. He wasn't sure if she wanted him to answer. "My father," she continued. "He served during hard times. He was quiet, like you. Always carried weight on his shoulders, but never showed it. I never told him how much I admired him until it was too late." Her voice shook slightly, and John noticed her fingers tightening against her knee. For the first time, the strong commander looked human, fragile even. "People laugh when they don't understand," John finally said. "I've learned not to take it to heart." Grace turned her eyes to him, and for a moment, there was no rank between them. Just two people, bound by pain and unspoken memories. "You carry more than any of them realize," she said quietly. "But that tattoo, it's not just a mark, is it? It's a story." John's throat tightened. He nodded slowly. "It is. Every line, every scar, it tells where I've been. And sometimes, when the nights get long, it's all that keeps me standing." Grace didn't press him further, but her silence carried understanding. She rose to leave, but before walking away, she placed her hand lightly on his shoulder. "Keep standing, John. Some of us notice." When she left, John stared at the photo of Daniel again. He felt a strange warmth inside, a quiet reassurance that maybe he wasn't as alone as he thought. The next morning, training was harder than ever. The recruits were pushed to their limits, but something had shifted. Those who once laughed at John now glanced at him differently. They didn't speak it out loud, but their eyes held respect. Some even followed his lead during drills, trusting his silent discipline more than their own energy. During a grueling obstacle course, one young recruit named Michael stumbled and fell hard. The others rushed past, desperate to finish first, but John slowed down, reached back, and pulled him up. "Come on," he said firmly, his voice carrying strength. "You're not staying down." Michael gasped for air but pushed forward with John's help. They crossed the line together, and though John wasn't first, the act didn't go unnoticed. Commander Grace had been watching. She gave no praise, no speech. Just a small nod, but John caught it. It meant more than any words. That night in the mess hall, the recruits who once mocked him now sat closer, their tone softer. Michael even said, "Thanks, John. I wouldn't have finished without you." John simply nodded, his usual quiet self. But deep inside, he felt something stir: acceptance. Not just as a soldier, but as a man who carried his past without shame. Later, when he returned to his bunk, he found something unexpected. A folded note left on his bed. He opened it carefully. "You are not invisible. Some of us learn more from you than from any book or speech. Keep going." No signature, but John knew whose handwriting it was: Commander Grace. For the first time in years, John lay on his bunk with a small smile on his face. He closed his eyes, hearing the quiet breathing of the recruits around him, and for once, the silence felt comforting, not heavy. The tattoo on his back still carried his scars, but now, it also carried something else: a bridge between his past and his future. He whispered softly, "For you, Daniel." And as sleep took him, he realized that the respect he had never asked for was beginning to bloom, not from fear, but from the strength of simply being who he was. The morning fog had barely lifted when the camp came alive with the sounds of boots pounding against the wet ground. The recruits lined up in silence, their faces tight with concentration. Today was different. Laura had planned a new test, one that would push them not only physically, but mentally and emotionally. The challenge was simple in words but nearly impossible in practice: a night exercise in the forest outside the camp, navigating through obstacles, thick brush, and uneven terrain, all while carrying heavy packs. No lights, no clear path. Only trust in themselves and their teammates. Tom adjusted his pack and looked at the younger recruits around him. Many still looked nervous, some even afraid. The storms from previous days had left the ground slippery, and the forest loomed dark and silent beyond the treeline. Whispers of doubt spread through the group. "You don't know what's out there," one recruit said. "It's going to be chaos." Tom didn't reply. He knelt for a moment, tightening his boots, and quietly whispered, "Stay close. Step by step. One at a time." His calm voice cut through the rising panic, grounding the men around him. The march began, slow and steady. Twigs snapped beneath boots, leaves rustled in the breeze, and the darkness made every sound feel louder. Some recruits stumbled, their nerves threatening to break them. Tom stayed at the center, moving deliberately, his hands reaching back to help anyone who slipped. Hours passed. Cold and fatigue gnawed at them. Some complained, some wanted to turn back, but Tom kept moving. His quiet strength became a beacon. One by one, the recruits followed, adjusting to his rhythm rather than their own panic. At a particularly steep hill, a young recruit named David fell hard, twisting his ankle. The others froze, unsure what to do. Tom was immediately at his side, checking quickly, then lifting the young man onto his shoulders. The pack dug into Tom's back, the weight pulling at his shoulders, but he refused to pause. Step by step, he carried David up the hill, never once losing balance. When they reached the top, some of the men gasped, others whispered in disbelief. "How is he doing that?" one asked, staring at the older man who had silently become their guide. Laura, observing from a safe distance, felt a pang in her chest. She had seen many soldiers in her life, but few had this quiet resilience. She also saw the faint outline of the tattoo on Tom's back, just visible beneath his damp shirt. Her heart tightened. She knew then that every mark, every line, carried a story of survival and loss that no ordinary man could bear. The forest test continued, darkness pressing down, winds rattling the trees. But under Tom's guidance, the recruits moved forward, one careful step at a time. By the time they reached the clearing that marked the end of the course, everyone was soaked, shivering, and exhausted. But none of them had quit. None of them had given up. When the men finally collapsed in the grass, breathing heavily, silence hung over them. Not the silence of fear or doubt, but of awe. The older veteran, the man they had once mocked, had led them through the impossible. Laura approached then, stepping into the clearing. Her eyes scanned the group, finally resting on Tom. "You didn't just finish the course," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You carried others with you when no one else could." Tom's breath came heavy. He shook his head, as if it wasn't a big deal. "Someone had to," he said simply. She studied him, noting the sweat-streaked face, the trembling arms, and the determined eyes. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she said, "Not many men could have done what you just did. You've earned more than respect, you've earned trust." Tom looked down at the ground, thinking of Daniel. He imagined the smile his little boy would give if he could see him now. He whispered softly, "For you, Daniel. Every step is for you." The recruits, hearing him speak, glanced at each other. They had never heard him mention his son before. There was a hush as they realized that everything he had done, every moment of endurance, wasn't about proving himself to them, it was about his child, his promise to someone he loved more than life itself. That evening, back at the barracks, the recruits moved differently around him. They no longer saw him as just a veteran or an older man. They saw a leader. They saw someone who carried invisible burdens but refused to bend under them. Some of the men even stayed up late that night, quietly talking about the lessons they had learned from him, lessons of patience, endurance, and quiet strength. Laura, meanwhile, lingered outside the barracks, watching Tom sit alone, staring at the picture of Daniel once more. She felt a deep respect for the man, stronger than any she had felt for other soldiers in her command. And in the silence of that night, she made a quiet promise to herself, to ensure that his story, his service, and the sacrifices he carried would not remain hidden. Tom closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the day, the forest, and the lives of the men he had guided. And for the first time in years, he felt that the burdens on his back were shared not by all the world, but by a few who had begun to understand him. The morning of graduation arrived with crisp air and bright sunlight. The camp had never felt so alive. Flags waved in the gentle breeze, the drums beat steadily, and the recruits stood at attention, their uniforms sharp, their boots polished. Months of pain, sweat, and struggle had led to this day. Tom stood among them, his body still carrying the soreness of drills, marches, and nights in the forest. But his back was straight, his shoulders strong, and his heart full. Today, he would not only finish the program, he would be seen for the man he had always been. The other recruits glanced at him now with respect, not just for his strength but for the quiet courage that had guided them. Some of the young men who had mocked him months ago approached him cautiously, offering small nods, words of thanks, even smiles. Commander Laura stepped forward to address the gathered recruits. Her voice carried authority, but there was a warmth in her tone as she spoke. Today, we honor not just the completion of a program, but the endurance, courage, and leadership each of you have shown. But there is one among you whose strength has quietly inspired everyone here. One man who has carried more than his share, yet never complained. One man who has led when others could not. All eyes turned to Tom. A hush fell over the crowd. Some of the younger recruits looked at him, their mouths open in disbelief. The man they had laughed at, called old and slow, was being recognized above them. Laura continued, her eyes locking on his. Tom, you have shown what true strength is. Not in speed, not in muscle, but in heart. You have carried your team, guided them through impossible trials, and done it all for someone you love. That is the mark of a leader. Tom's throat tightened. He felt his cheeks grow warm, not from pride, but from the recognition of all the silent battles he had fought. He thought of Daniel, his little boy who had been his reason for everything. He thought of the nights he had carried pain in his body and memories in his heart. Laura reached into her pocket and held up a folded certificate, the highest honor of the camp. This, she said, handing it to him, is for your courage, leadership, and dedication. We are proud to have had you here. Tom accepted it with trembling hands. He glanced at the recruits, then at Laura, and finally, he whispered softly, "For you, Daniel." A small cheer broke out among the recruits. Not loud and chaotic like the laughter of before, but sincere and filled with admiration. They had seen the man behind the scars, the veteran who had endured battles no one else could imagine. And they respected him deeply for it. After the ceremony, Tom's fellow recruits gathered around him. Michael, the young man he had carried during the night exercise, spoke first. "I never thought I'd say this, but, thank you. You've taught me more than anyone else here." David, who had twisted his ankle on the forest trail, added, "You didn't just help us finish. You made us better." Tom shook his head slowly, smiling softly. "I didn't do it for praise. I did it for my boy. And I'm glad I could help you along the way." Anna, who had arrived earlier that morning, ran toward him as soon as the ceremony ended. Her small arms wrapped around his legs, and she looked up at him with wide eyes. "Daddy. You did it?" Tears filled Tom's eyes. He knelt down and hugged her tightly. "Yes, baby. I did it. And now, you can be proud of your dad." Laura watched from a short distance, her expression softer than it had ever been in public. She stepped forward, kneeling slightly to meet Tom's eyes. "I know what your tattoo means," she said quietly. "I know the stories you carry, and I know the men whose lives you honored. You don't need to say anything else. Just know your strength has not gone unnoticed." Tom nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He reached back slightly, unconsciously feeling the tattoo on his back, the symbol that had carried his past, his pain, and his memories. For years, it had been hidden, personal, and a reminder of loss. Now, it felt lighter. Not because the scars were gone, but because someone finally understood what they meant. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the yard, Tom stood, holding Anna's hand, facing the field. He looked at the men around him, recruits who had mocked, doubted, and now respected him, and he felt a quiet pride that had nothing to do with medals. It was the pride of knowing he had endured, of knowing he had guided others, and of knowing he had fulfilled his promise to his son. Laura stepped back, letting him take the moment. She watched as the recruits began to disperse, some coming to shake his hand, others simply nodding in silent acknowledgement. And in that moment, Tom felt a peace he had not known in years. Finally, he turned to Anna and smiled. "See, baby girl. They finally see what I always told you. Your dad never quit." Anna giggled and squeezed his hand. "I knew it, Daddy. I always knew it." Tom's heart swelled. The months of hardship, pain, and endurance had led to this, a moment of recognition, love, and understanding. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly lighter, not because the battles were over, but because the world had finally seen the man he had always been. And for Tom, that was enough.